Good evening and welcome to BRICS Postcolonialism. My sincere thanks to all my colleagues here at the Einstein Forum, without whose organizational and intellectual input this conference would not have taken place. My sincere thanks to all of you who are here, and I would like to try and set us up, give us a framing device. What I would also like not to do is to impose my own framing on the proceedings. So instead of explaining to you what I think we have to learn from this, I would like to share my initial questions with which I started thinking about this topic. Since we have had a certain amount of time during which we are said to have all become post-colonially minded or decolonially minded, and since we are now invited to decolonize everything, from the history of states, of institutions, to the history of mathematics and toothpicks, we are faced with a large set of ethical questions. Post-colonialism, decoloniality, please note that it's an ism and an ity, and its moral and ethical assumptions surround us in our academic lives. They have increasingly made their way into the public domain. We find them in the language of policy, artistic endeavor, and civilized interaction in more general terms. Now, BRICS is not something that we would normally associate with a civil society framework, and to demystify this acronym for those who haven't come across it before, BRICS, now BRICS Plus, is a group of countries. A plus is always an addition and an improvement. It's a group of countries that seek to engage the world, its economy, and its power dynamics in new and improved ways. The group comprises Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, and it's now joined by Iran, but it's actually more than a group of countries. It is a set of ideas, and as we go along, we'll hear about why this new set of states, shall we say, that choose to present themselves as an alternative to the world order as we know it, come together in this conglomerate. In the shorthand that we've come to expect from post-colonialism and decoloniality, we could say that the one advantage of this conglomerate is that it is not Western. But we are now in a situation, we have a number of diffuse notions that are organized around the term post-colonialism, decoloniality, to which we could add theory from the global south, all of which are themselves somewhat slippery. We don't know what they are, but we know that they are good things. It is also true that most people who would identify with any of these categories would not necessarily tell you why they do, how they do, and they would prefer not to tell you what exactly they are. But these are the most successful ideas to emerge from academia into public life. And they now ground the pronouncements of museum curators, cultural ministries, and a vast spectrum of artistic and policy institutions and funding bodies. But of course, they are somewhat intimidating since no one seems to know precisely what they are. Now, we add to that something which I think belongs in this categorization, and it's called white guilt. Now, without white guilt, none of this really truly functions, because the purpose of the scare that comes with the need to decolonize everything is the potential or actual argument that we live in a world dominated by the West, overwhelmingly white and racist, and very little can be done to change this other than the general idea that we must decolonize, we must have a post-colonial sense of the world. Now, what happens to this sense of social justice for ordinary citizens when the language of social justice is appropriated by states? Now, these states are not exactly organized around principles of equality. They're not necessarily organized around principles that we would recognize as intended for any kind of radical potential for self-expression of either its citizens or any other citizens. On the contrary, many of these states take great pride in the fact that they are non-Western states, that they do not have to observe what they, in the language of Vladimir Putin, would call the colonial language of human rights. But if Putin makes this argument one day, there are several other ways to make this argument. The Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi has often been quoted as explaining that the world is run according to the principles of the West, and this has to change. We now also have scholars who will produce papers declaring themselves to be adherents of a school of international relations from the global South. This all makes us a little bit awkward about what it is that we're trying to do here. And we must deal today with a phenomenon that I will call the post-colonial right, or we could call it the decolonial right. Now, of course, we are supposed to be beyond the concepts of left and right in all of this, but the advocating of the privilege of the voices of victim communities, making anti-rationalist assertions about the importance of affect, emotions, and the reassertion of cultural or religious identities have come together in a conjuncture that has produced a renaissance of right-wing, anti-liberal, and we could even say neo-fascist forms of legitimation. The affinities among post-colonial writers' claims to the cultural uniqueness of specific post-colonies, the importance of claiming the status of victimhood in history, and an old-fashioned and pre-post-colonial assertion of what in Germany we might have called völkisch nationalism, are obvious to most observers who have encountered these arguments. Instead of seeing them as causally related or necessarily implying a conscious or conspiratorial link among these strands of thought, it is perhaps more useful to analyze what various moves in the direction of indigenism have contributed to the resurgence of a völkisch imagination, and to what extent post-colonial thought and decoloniality more generally leads us to where we are today. Now, since terms and concepts are not synonymous, the same term might denote different concepts in different contexts, and the same concepts might be rendered by different terms. All of this becomes even more difficult to pin down. If we were to attempt something of a preliminary definition, we might want to say that post-colonialism indicates a state usually after the end of formal colonial empires, in which certain intangible effects of the colonial condition persist. Decoloniality, on the other hand, is a slightly improved and later term which refers to the need to outdo the effects of colonization that that persist into the present, and in particular to see the world from beyond the confines of the Eurocentrism and Westernism that it is alleged still characterizes dominant forms of knowledge, knowledge production, and therefore social control mechanisms. All of this connects in what we might call theory from the global south, which refers to a perceived need in the interests of postcolonialism and decoloniality to see the world through concepts that have been developed in and largely for the global south. And the global south is, well, that part of the world that has been historically oppressed, the artist formerly known as the underdeveloped or the third world. A proper positioning in terms of this cluster of terms, or conglomerate if you prefer, is the basis for the right to speak. The basis of a relevant claim to an authentic right to stand up as the oppressed. The legitimacy of the speaking voice itself depends on this. That speaking voice must provide its own genealogy of oppression in order to complete the circular argument that the oppressed must speak as the oppressed. We shall for now defer the question as to whether they can only speak to the oppressed. And here we have a different question, and we come back to the question of white guilt. Because when you speak as the oppressed, and you don't have a listener who is willing to accept your right to speak as the oppressed, then the game doesn't work. So in other words, this is an enormously performative act, continuously presented before an audience that must defer to your sense of victimhood. No matter how you wish to present yourself, without at least the implicit hint of your victim narrative providing your legitimation, you don't have a speaking voice. Now, this becomes even more awkward when you recognize that the global south is supposed to give voice to people in countries outside the West, but the places that give most voice to the global south are located in either the West or the global North, which are, of course, the same place. Since geographies get a little confused here, by the way, the West is the North, and the South is the non-West. Just to make it more complicated, South Africa is the north of the global South, and the global South is probably located in Duke University in the United States. So when we get to this situation, we ask the question as to whether these games can only be played outside the realms of what we would call the global South. Now, what becomes tricky here is since, in essence, each country, usually each nation state, in a kind of BRICS mode, is claiming to be some kind of self-contained and culturally unique space. What binds one part of the global South to another part of the global South? Nothing more than a collective claim of victimhoods that are comparable. And here we run into all kinds of trouble when one set of victimhoods clash with another set of victimhoods. Now, this isn't usually very surprising for people in any one or other country of the global South, because being located in one part of it doesn't make you think that you are automatically a citizen of the other parts. But it is very confusing for the white guilty who assume that continuity. Now, this then leaks back into the politics of any country in the global North, which by now has a problem, or if you prefer it, a situation of migration from the global south to the global north. And they don't know quite what to do with their assumptions about the global south when it leaks back into the global north, and the people from the global south in the global north refuse to conform to the expectations of white guilt and behave as they should do when fixed in their respective places. And the tricky part of all of this is that it has frozen up old forms of political thinking across the world into a situation where the global south, whether it is located in the global north or back home in the global south or anywhere else, is supposedly beyond the politics of left, right, center, center-left, or anything else. People from certain parts of the world are talked about in politics, but almost never listened to unless they speak in the collective voice of the global south. So the idea that a person of foreign origin might actually have an individuated sense of politics is looking very difficult to achieve, especially in a situation where you are fixed into either speaking with and on behalf of your sectarian loyalty, or you don't have a voice. Now, this is an interesting fixing, which then makes us come face to face with a politics of what I would call a post-left. Now, what's a post-left? A post-left are probably people who very ardently think of themselves as for social justice, acting on behalf of the global south with all the patronizing connections and assumptions that brings with it. And if somebody were to oppose that position and they were to come from a certain part of the world which is identified as global south, they would be seen as inauthentic voices. And so we're back to the question of authentic voices. Now I want to linger on this point for a few seconds, because the authentic voice is something which requires you to adopt a loyalty, predict what that loyalty's politics is going to be, and to insist from that point onwards that the only correct position for a certain genre of people connects to that authentic voice. Now, this is actually not at all decolonial or post-colonial, it's very colonial. Because as we know, colonial states were very used to finding the native voice that they wished to support and listen to that voice. And if that voice gave them the message they wanted, that was the authentic voice. Everybody else was the inauthentic voice. So if we discover along the way that the post-colonial and the decolonial are actually pretty colonial, then we might wonder why we're here at all. But that actually brings us back to the question of states. Because the term colonial state, implying the fact that that state is not backed by the authentic voice of its own people, but is backed by the rule of the foreign, by implication the inauthentic, used to be grounded in the idea of the democratic right to self-representation, or the idea of self-determination, with the awkward question being that self-determination could only be collectively expressed in the form of nationhood. And we get from there into the question of whether the nation part of nation states was always simply window dressing of legitimation. If we agree that states are organized expressions of violence, and that the legitimacy of this violence doesn't have to come from the nationness of states, but the legitimacy of the violence is simply legitimate because state violence is part of being a state, then there is nothing in particular which makes that insistence on stateness any more than a factor of being a state. When, therefore, a state adopts the legitimation of post-colonial or decolonial thought, claiming for itself a victimhood as a state entity, then obviously we're talking about an abuse of power. But the idea of fixed and authentic forms of being, which come as much from colonial thought as post-colonial forms of thought, would automatically seem to imply a return or a perpetuation of concepts of blood and soil, which then connect the forms of decolonial and post-colonial nationality to forms of völkisch and fascist forms of nationality. And whether we think this is a misuse, an abuse, or a deviation from the original noble forms of post-colonial or decolonial thinking, or whether we think it is inherent in decolonial or post-colonial thinking, is a question we must keep open. Because there is nothing in forms of collective imagination that fix the collective beforehand, which open it up to any form of democratic challenge. But as we know, democracy is a Western concept, now that we agree that Greece was Western as well. Why we do that might have something to do with Edward Said, but we won't bring him into it. We can leave the question open, because I think everybody has a different answer to it. Is the question of post-coloniality, post-colonialism, decoloniality, and decolonization, all of which in different contexts have different meanings, something that sets a train of thought in motion that eventually coalesces around states claiming collective victimhood and cementing absolute power by claiming to speak on behalf of their people? Or is this a misuse or an abuse of post-colonialism or decolonial thinking? And I think that we would all have different emphases and answers to this, not least because the categories that we seem to be addressing, postcoloniality, postcolonialism, decoloniality, and the global south are all very nebulous. But we have a much clearer idea of what states are. And perhaps that's the point from which we could start. What happens when a state appropriates an apparently liberatory rhetoric? And I'll stop there. I think that's enough by way of introduction. And I would like to then give the floor to Ali Fatullah Najad. Thank you.